There were 6 friends who went to university together. After their final exams, they decided to go on a camping trip in the wilderness. After driving for several hours, they finally reached the Black Lagoon. It was beside a cliff ideal for diving. They pitched their tents in a clearing in the woods and spent the evening swimming in the water, the warm, clear water. As the sun was beginning to set, one of the friends went up to the highest point on the cliff and jumped off, while the other 5 watched. Their laughter slowly subsided as they waited for him to surface. It only took half a minute for them to dive in after their friend. Struggling and sputtering among the reeds and the lagoon, they searched hopelessly for him. Finally, they disentangled themselves and came up, but they never saw their friend again. Heartbroken, they returned to the city and passed a strange and lonely year in which their only solace was knowing that they would return to the lagoon to honor the anniversary of their friend's death. A year passed by, and they returned to the lagoon as a memorial, but as they approached, they saw a figure at the edge of the water. It was their friend. He was just standing there with his back to them, his head bowed. Excitedly, they called out to him and began running towards him, but he didn't turn around. As they got closer, they shouted louder and louder, but he still didn't react. They were running towards him, but suddenly they stopped dead in their tracks. At the edge of the water, they saw no one, but they saw not one, but 5 crosses. Mummy told me to never open the basement door. One day, I heard a strange whining noise. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I wanted to see what was making the noise down there. It sounded like a puppy whining. I always wanted a puppy, so I opened the basement door and tiptoed down the stairs. All I wanted to do was take a little peek at the puppy. I wanted to see how cute he was. But there was no puppy. Mummy came and dragged me back upstairs. She was angry. She yelled at me, she scolded me, and she told me never ever go down in that basement again. Mummy had a look in her eyes that scared me. I started to cry. I was afraid to ask her why there was a boy in the basement. I was afraid to ask her why he was making that whining noise. I was afraid to ask her why he had no hands, and he had no feet either. He was dead, that much was clear. She looked from the still body lying on the road to the dented hood of her BMW in a panic. She'd gotten out of trouble before, but nothing on this scale. This didn't seem like something she could just make go away. She contemplated the broken form in front of her. He seemed homeless. Ancient, tattered clothing, grizzled features. Hell, even for a corpse, he looked sickly. There was a drainage ditch by the side of the road, and well, odds were, no one would miss him anyway. It didn't take much force to nudge his emaciated form in. Her ill-gotten relief was cut short, however, as a hand closed around her throat. A harsh voice whispered in her ear, "Just so you know, I only eat the ones who try to leave. Would you let you go if you tried to help?" And in one swift movement, he snapped her neck. "We're both monsters," he hissed. "I'm just more honest about it." I was at work when I got the phone call. It was the police. They said a girl had wandered into the police station. She didn't know her name. She didn't know where she lived. They found my number on her cell phone. "Do you know anyone fitting that description?" they asked. I told them I didn't. "Can you come down to the police station and see if you can identify her?" they asked. I told them that I would be there as soon as possible. I had no idea who it could be, so I got into my car and drove down to the station. As I walked through the double doors, I saw her sitting in the waiting room. I recognized her immediately. She was my daughter. It had been 10 years since I'd last set eyes on her. 10 years since I reported her missing to the police. 10 years since I killed her and buried her body under my house. The children were excited. Their favorite uncle was coming to visit. He was an adventurer, and his journeys had taken him to many mysterious and exotic places. His latest trip was to a remote region deep in the heart of Africa. The children could hardly wait to hear the tales he would tell. When their uncle arrived, he had a broad smile on his face. After he greeted their parents, the children dragged him into the living room and made him sit down. They begged him to tell the story about his recent adventures. "Very well," said the uncle. "I'll tell you about the most terrifying creature I have ever seen. We came across it in the most remote part of the jungle. It's a massive spider, almost half a meter in diameter. The most interesting thing about it is that this creature had a most peculiar survival tactic. It is a parasite. When it attacks its prey, it enters the animal through the mouth and crawls down into the belly. From there, it can take over the host's nervous system and control its movement, essentially rendering the host a useless puppet. It stays in the animal's body and feeds off it just long enough to plant its eggs. Then, it goes searching for a new host." The children's eyes widened. "What a fascinating creature," they exclaimed. "Imagine what would happen if it made its way here to Canada." "Well, perhaps it already has," their uncle said with a smile. He then cocked his head back, and terrible gagging noises came from his throat. As the children watched in horror, blood started pouring from his eyes, ears, and nose, and 8 long, spindly legs emerged from his mouth. They call him the Blind Painter. He was an old man in his early 70s, and he lived in a small house on the edge of town. He was an acclaimed artist, but he had been completely blind since the day he was born. Despite his disability, he had painted some of the greatest works of art anyone had ever seen. People came from far and wide to have their portrait done by the Blind Painter. As long as they paid the requested fee, he would paint a portrait of anyone. Nobody knew how he was able to paint with such skill, even though he couldn't see the person sitting in front of him. It was an uncanny ability that defied logic. I arranged for him to paint my portrait one day, so on the appointed day I walked up to his house and knocked on the front door. When it opened, I saw the Blind Painter standing there, leaning on his cane. His face was drawn and wrinkled. His eyes were milky white. He invited me in, and I followed him as he shuffled down a long hallway. In his studio, I handed over an envelope containing his fee. He thanked me and told me to sit on a stool. He stood behind an easel with a blank canvas on it and picked up his paintbrush. "Before we begin, I must warn you," he said. "Sometimes I paint too far." I had no idea what he meant. His paintings were always beautiful, so I was sure I would be satisfied with the finished product. I sat there, adopting a pose, as he started painting. Hours passed and neither one of us said a word. The Blind Painter never looked up from his canvas. His brush traveled back and forth, and his brow was wrinkled in concentration. Finally, he put his brush down. "I am finished," he said, and beckoned for me to come over and take a look. As soon as I set my eyes on the painting, I was horrified. He had painted me lying on the ground, surrounded by a pool of blood. My throat had been sliced open, and my body was covered in stab wounds. My dead eyes were glazed over, and there was a look of terror frozen on my face. "Why?" I asked, stepping back in horror. "Why would you paint something like this?" The Blind Painter looked at me with his sad, milky white eyes. "I warned you," he said. "Sometimes I paint too far. Sometimes I paint the future."